Good afternoon. My name is Abby Dobson, and I am president of the New York City chapter of the National Organization for Women. Welcome to Remaking a Feminist Future, Building an Inclusive Movement. This is a webinar about racism and our collective need to tackle it head on. White supremacy and the many faces of racism operate in tandem to restrict our collective capacity to live free, productive, and just lives. It is such a huge topic to tackle, particularly because of the ways in which it has been foundational to the support or curtailment of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because of this, I will call on and invoke the expertise of scholars and activists who continue to serve as amazing resources for us all. Through the magic of technology and the depth of the Black Feminist Archive, these experts will speak to us on various issues in their own voices. We owe them a great debt of gratitude. Alicia Garza, co-founder of Black Lives Matter and principal of the Black Futures Lab, discusses the complexity of race and racism in this first clip.
I think race and racism is probably the most studied social, economic, and political phenomenon in this country, but it's also the least understood. The reality is that race in the United States operates on a spectrum from black to white. Doesn't mean that people who are in between don't experience racism, but it means that the closer you are to white on that spectrum, the better off you are. And the closer to black that you are on that spectrum, the worse off you are. When we think about how we address problems in this country, we often start from a place of trickle-down justice. So using white folks as the control, we say, well, if we make things better for white folks, then everybody else is going to get free. But actually, it doesn't work that way. We have to address problems at the root. And when you deal with what's happening in Black communities, it creates an effervescence, right? So a bubble up rather than a trickle down. Let me give an example. When we talk about the wage gap, we often say women make 78 cents to every dollar that a man makes. Y'all have heard that before. But those are the statistics for white women and white men. The reality is that Black women make something like 64 cents to every 78 cents that white women make. When we talk about Latinas, it goes down to about 58 cents. If we were to talk about Indigenous women, if we were to talk about trans women, it would even go farther down. So again, if you deal with those who are the most impacted, everybody has an opportunity to benefit from that, rather than dealing with the folks who are not as impacted, right, and expecting it to trickle down.
So when we examine and dig at the root of racism in this country, we strike at the very heart of anti-Blackness, a powerful organizing principle, structuring the ways groups of all stripes relate to and treat each other. Full transparency. Because of this, the focus of this webinar will be on anti-Black white supremacy and racism. Where to begin? The brilliant Kimberly Crenshaw, noted legal scholar and activist, who coined the term intersectionality, and also the co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, has a saying that I love. If you can't see a problem, you can't solve it. We have to be able to see a problem to fix it. In 2020, what have we seen? What do we see? We see a pandemic where the likelihood of comorbidity factors stemming from the effects of structural racism are higher for Black and Brown people, impacting their survivability and vulnerability when stricken with COVID-19. We see a nation reckoning with its racist past and present. We see the lingering effects of the structural dimensions of racism. Tricia Rose, director of Brown University's Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, summarizes structural racism and colorblind ideology in this next video clip.
Aspect of life, jobs, employment, wealth, discrimination in education, criminal justice, media, housing, health, mental health, insurance agencies, loans, banking, every aspect of life that we can think about has significant forms of elements of structural racism, or shall we say evidence of racial disparity that's operating. There's been a pretty explicit ideological war over the past 40 years between the story of structural racism and the emergent and now dominant story of colorblindness. So let's start with just some basic definitions. Structural racism in the US is the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal, that routinely advantage whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. Colorblindness, or I'm calling it colorblind ideology, makes the argument that only the absence of accounting for race will bring racial equality, and that we must reject all racial categorizations, record keeping, make no distinctions based on race in order to reach a colorblind context for a fair, equal society. So it fundamentally relies on the idea that race is not operating now and that we must keep it that way by being colorblind. But colorblindness is extremely resistant to illuminating any categories of race and therefore any measurements, which makes, of course, the whole structural racism argument completely antithetical to colorblind ideology. But it also assumes, in addition to that race doesn't matter now, it also means that we have to assume racial hierarchies are not already operating, that society is fundamentally fair if it's left alone to its own devices. It also rejects policies that are designed, and this is very important because colorblind ideology has been at the heart of the ending of any kinds of programs designed to redress a legacy of structural discrimination. So you can't solve the problem by saying anything that looks like affirmative action in any sphere becomes extremely problematic in the context of colorblind ideology. And this is how sort of everyday people can back themselves into the logic of colorblindness. People would say to themselves, well, since most people believe in racial equality, which includes myself, and since the laws have been changed to outlaw discrimination, and since I don't see color, well, we'll give you that one, so I can't be a racist, and since no special benefits are accrued to me based on whiteness, question mark, racism isn't causing these inequalities. So you end up with a kind of if-then, if all these things are true, then I don't know what y'all problems are about, right? Because I've passed my own litmus test. So what remains left here at the end of this kind of self-check? What remains left is actually the heart of colorblind ideology in the way it gets deployed, and that's the behavior. Because colorblind ideology imagines that there are no structures impeding us, so we have a kind of individual capacity, and this must be about the behavior of those who are being discriminated against. They must either bring it upon themselves or be uninterested, and they have imputed cultural limitations that get understood as motivating their experiences with structural racism.
And so one of the striking observations that Tricia Rose makes is that there is this perception among many people, white people in particular, that our society is fundamentally fair when left to its own devices. Further, the belief that equality already exists bolsters the categorical rejection of policies that might actually address structural racism. For instance, a living wage for people working in this country. History has taught us that this perception is false. We know that racial hierarchies exist and that opportunities, and threats flow depending on one's place on the pyramid. In addition, Rose notes that this perception drives a rejection of the very consciousness that is needed to fight structural racism. I would add a consciousness born from a willingness to see the problem, see inequities for what they are in order to with intention address them. There is in fact a willful resistance, Rose points out, to this consciousness. And we have to ask ourselves, why? So let's look at a few scenarios in our first poll on systemic racism or white privilege or both. We invite you to participate. Please read each question, take about 10 seconds between each question, and choose one of 3 options. In your assessment, which of these scenarios is an example of white privilege, systemic racism, or both? White people are less likely to be followed, questioned, or searched by law enforcement because they look suspicious. White privilege, systemic racism, or both? White people are more likely to be perceived as competent and knowledgeable in professional and academic environments. White privilege, systemic racism, or both? Be sure to scroll down so that you can see all questions. Black and brown workers historically earn less than white workers. White privilege, systemic racism, or both? A police officer is more likely to shoot an unarmed Black or brown person because she or he feared for his or her life. White privilege, systemic racism, or both? White people are more likely to be given the benefit of the doubt at a neighborhood pool. They are not asked to show identification when Black people are. White privilege, systemic racism, or both? Please take a few moments and respond to the poll. Let's do about 10 more seconds. I am looking for the results of the poll, which popped up but then left me. Can someone pop them up for me once again? Or put them in the chat. I did see the first one, that 90% of you felt that it was both. The second one. %77% said both. Okay, the third one, 63% said both. The fourth one, 55% said both. And the final one, 77% said both. Thank you. So the first, white people are less likely to be followed, questioned, or searched by law enforcement. Most of us said both. They're really, all these questions strike at the heart of the extent to which white privilege and systemic racism are both 2 sides of the same coin. White privilege is an unstated, almost invisible understanding of whiteness as normal, as normality, as right, as superior, as without restriction, as the default setting. So for the first one, I would say white privilege, but that can easily, the other side of that is in fact systemic racism. For the second one, White people are more likely to be perceived as competent and knowledgeable in professional and academic environments. That is definitely about white privilege, but in terms of how it plays itself, can become something that is about systemic racism. Black and brown workers historically earn less than white workers. I would say that that is systemic racism. Police officer is more likely to shoot an unarmed Black or brown person because she or he feared for his life. Systemic racism, it's an affirmative act against a Black person. A white person shooting people at a protest and walking down the street with a gun, but not being apprehended immediately, not getting thrown to the ground immediately when they're white is white privilege. And that happened during the protests this summer. A person shooting up a church during a Bible study and getting to go to McDonald's on the way to the prison after the massacre is also another exercise of white privilege. If a cop pulls you over for speeding and it wasn't because of the color of your skin, it was really about the taillight, a broken taillight, that's an example of white privilege. When you can shop alone in a store without worrying that you're being followed or harassed because you're suspected of being a shoplifter, that's about white privilege. If you're calling the cops on a group of Black people barbecuing in a public park, that's an example of white privilege. When you're calling cops on a bird watching Black man who asks you to put your dog on a leash, that is an example of white privilege. And finally, when you call the cops on a young Black girl who is selling lemonade at a stand in front of her apartment, which is also your apartment, and you are white, that is an example of white privilege. These are all things that actually happened. All were a part of the news headline, of the news cycle within the last few years. As this next slide shows, there's a pyramid to systemic racism. Systemic racism is more institutionalized mechanisms for maintaining racial hierarchies of access, wealth, and preferential treatment based on race. Think of housing, employment, criminal justice, and educational discrimination. Think subprime mortgages given to Black and brown women with good credit histories when their white counterparts were not offered things that would essentially lead to them losing their homes down the line. For some, all of this systemic racism is an investment to be accrued through the maintaining of white privilege. Scholar George Lipsitz refers to an investment in whiteness. Scholar David Roediger refers to the wages of whiteness. This investment or wage in whiteness and systemic racism based on white supremacy comes with dividends that pay in perpetuity or cost in perpetuity. Let's follow two young boys, Jamal and Kevin, and their journey through life. Let's follow the investments and disinvestments made in persons based on race over and across generations that is discussed in this animated video short.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
As you can see, these compounding investments or disinvestments structure lives in really real ways. They speak to property interest in whiteness and the devaluation of Blackness and non-white racial identities in so many areas of life. An important example of systemic racism is the way we devalue work performed by women generally, but women of color in particular. Our domestic workers, our nursing assistants, our childcare workers, our cashiers, our grocery store workers, etc. When we talk about pay and benefit inequalities or disinvestments that impact wage and wealth gap for generations, we're talking about systemic racism and something that we all need to be concerned about. What else do we see? In this next slide, we see how Americans voted this election cycle in 2020. What we see are these investments tied up in the calls to invent fraud where there is none in order to hold on to presidential power, used to, among other things, promote and normalize white supremacy and nationalism, and white nationalism rather. Americans voted largely along racial lines, as you can see from the graphic, this election cycle, as they did the last. The racial hierarchy inherent in white supremacy was on the ballot. 55% of white women voted for Trump, up from 53% in 2016. 61% of white men voted for Trump, down from 62% in 2016. This next slide about white supremacy, a pyramid rather, shows us the conditions and the actions that range from normalization to genocide that serve as the container and the context in which these votes were cast. In the past several years, we've seen indifference, we've seen minimization, we've seen veiled racism, discrimination, calls for violence, and genocide proliferate. From Trump's racist immigration policies and name calling for non-European nations like Haiti, from Trump's insistence in calling COVID the China virus, to his separation of brown children from their parents at the border, from tiki torches in Charlottesville to Trump's refusal to condemn white supremacy, from the recent executive order aimed at ending anti-bias and unconscious bias training that's federally funded, to the uptick in incidents of white nationalism shown on the next slide, to the rise in white supremacist propaganda shown in the following slide. We have to look at these graphics in context. Trump's acts of racism did not dissuade voters from supporting him. 70+ million Americans gave him their stamp of approval. And our nation needs to address this investment in white supremacy. As we speak, there is an event happening sponsored by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, with legal experts discussing the racial undertones and motivations at the heart of the choice to single out certain counties for lawsuits alleging voter fraud, counties in urban centers with sizable people of color, counties in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Detroit. This is the context in which the Black Lives Matter movement has become one of, if not the most powerful social justice movement in modern history. Co-founded by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, Inc. is a global organization in the US, UK, and Canada, whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and by vigilantes. The next slide shows Black Lives Matter as a powerful response to the nation's need to invest so much in white supremacy. Here is a little more about the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement and what it stands for.
What prompted Black Lives Matter was really around the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. I wrote a Facebook post, Black people, I love you, I love us. Our lives matter, Black Lives Matter. Patrisse put a hashtag in front of it, and I didn't know what a hashtag was. And Opal said, this is brilliant, and I think we should build something that connects people online and get people to do stuff together offline.
Alicia, Opal, and I created a container for Black protest to be seen and taken seriously. And then just like dandelions, folks bloomed out of that. And so we can't take sole responsibility for 3,000 protests around the globe, because that's people listening and responding and saying, okay, we hear the words Black Lives Matter, we're gonna prove it, we're gonna take it to the streets.
There are children who are coming of age in a generation where they see themselves as being affirmed and valued. We deserve to live in a multiracial democracy that works for all of us. And so this is not in vain. Keep on.
Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh, I hate when that happens. So let's take a moment to take a poll. 3 questions, yes or no yes or no responses. And these questions are all related to Black Lives Matter. Do you view Black Lives Matter as a social justice movement and advocacy group as a favorable intervention in the fight against racism and white supremacy? Yes or no? Does the phrase Black Lives Matter speak to you personally in a positive way? Yes or no? Do you believe that calls for recognition that Black lives matter mean that all other lives are less valued or less important? Yes or no? Let's take about 10 seconds. So let's have the results. A positive intervention, 98%. 2% said no. I'd love to hear from you guys in the chat about that. And I lost the response to that, the other 2 questions. 98% second question, 2% no. 98% yes. Okay, great. I think it's really important to ask questions like that, because when you start a movement or have a vision, sometimes it's misperceived or misrecognized. And so I thought it useful to include, again, Alicia Garza, giving her thoughts on particularly that last question. Do you believe that calls for recognition that Black Lives Matter means that other lives are less valued or less important?
To start off, Black Lives Matter has become, at this point, one of the most epic, familiar rallying cries of the American political landscape. And yet, some people are still very confused about what it means. So I was wondering if we could just start by you just giving us a brief clarifying introduction to Black Lives Matter and what that means to you.
You know, when you ask that question and you said it in that way, something happened for me, right? Because you're like, yeah, it's like all over the place, and some people claim to still not know what it means. Mm-hmm. And that feels willful to me, so I just want to say that. Because it's not rocket science, right? It's not quantum physics. It is the very notion that Black lives matter in a world where Black lives are being targeted systematically for demise, for destruction, for disregard. Mm-hmm. So I'll do the spiel again. We don't just care about Black people. It's not like, you know, Black folks trying to take over the world. Mm-hmm. You know, we're not going for Black supremacy. I've heard that too. That was interesting, right? I was like, Black supremacy. But look, it's the basic notion that Black people are deserving of dignity, respect, and humanity, that we are human beings, that we are not just human beings, but that we are human beings that have contributed everything to the building of this project of the nation state, and that we deserve to be treated with dignity. It's very basic. And it's not that we don't believe that all lives matter. We do believe that that should be true. But we don't live in that world, y'all. Again, this is not quantum physics, right? We don't live in a world where all lives matter. That is our aspirations, and we should absolutely be working towards that. Everything we do should be about affirming the humanity of every single person on this planet. But we don't live in that world. And when we say Black Lives Matter, it is both an affirmation to us, not to white people. People be like, why you try to plead to the white people? We're not. We are just saying that our lives are valuable, that we matter, right? That we deserve to be able to live in dignity, that we're human beings, and that our humanity should be respected and affirmed and appreciated.
And if we want to get to that place where all lives matter, then we have to acknowledge that Black lives matter too.
I think the words of Alicia Garza are really important. They really clarify the intent behind Black Lives Matter and the ways in which it is still misunderstood many years later after its founding. At this time, I'd love for us to reflect on a question together. And so if you have your cell phone and you can take notes on that, or you have some pen and paper, or just want to sort of ruminate and think about it. But here is the question, and let's take 2 minutes to think about this, and either write about it in the chat if you wish, or keep it just for yourself. And the question is, how has the movement for Black lives and the resistance to police brutality and racism generally in the streets impacted your life or views on racism in 2020? Let me read it again. How has the movement for Black lives and the resistance to police brutality and racism generally in the streets impacted your life or views on racism in 2020? 2 minutes begin now. About 30 more seconds. I see everyone, or many people chiming in the chat. That's really great. Something that I saw, someone wrote, because it's still scrolling, that they've instituted a lot of intentional anti-racist practices in their own life. It'd be great if you'd share some of what those are, just as a practice point for anyone who might be interested in more specifics. Now we have our next poll. Take about 10 seconds per question. This is a yes or no response. Have you ever witnessed a person of color experiencing racial discrimination before? Yes or no. Do you call out family members who hold racist views against people of color?
Abby, you're muted again.
Thank you. Not sure if you heard me reading questions. Do you believe that non-Black people of color can promote anti-Black racism and white supremacy? Do you believe that Trump's immigration policies are racist towards foreigners of color? Are you sometimes bothered when you hear people speaking in non-European languages? Have you experienced feelings of white fragility? About 10 seconds, and then let's have the results of the poll. Do we have the results? %86% says yes, they've witnessed a person of color experiencing racial discrimination. 97% calls out family members who hold racist views. Do you believe that racial justice and white supremacy were on the ballot? 97%. Do you believe that gender or sex discrimination is more problematic than racial discrimination? 16%. I'd love for those of you who feel 16% if you chime in the chat and just talk about that. Do you believe that non-Black people of color can promote anti-Black racism? 100% says yes. Do you believe that Trump's immigration policies are racist? 97%. Most of you are not bothered by people speaking in another language. Have you experienced feelings of white fragility? About half of you yes, half of you no. That's great. In our time remaining, I want us to think about what we need to do and where we need to go from here as an organization in order to intentionally fight racism, which is part of our mandate with NOW. What kinds of things can you do as a member, as a leader of NOW in New York and beyond to promote anti-racism, to eradicate white supremacy? Think about what you can do and bring that up in your chapter discussions, in your regional discussions. And for the time remaining, putting that in the chat. We're almost out of time. I also wanted to talk a little bit about white fragility, but I'll say this. One of the themes that is recurring is the willful resistance to acknowledging white privilege, which shows up in an oversensitivity to issues around white privilege, which Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility. We won't play that clip today, but we'll leave you with some recommendations on how to build feminist futures that are intersectional and that are anti-racist. We need more robust anti-racism and anti-bias training. We need to diversify our chapter boards. Diversity should not be about tokenism. We need to be intentional about our membership outreach, especially with respect to Black women and women of color. We need to form real partnerships with anti-racist and intersectional focused organizations led by women of color. We need to broaden the scope of our advocacy work and expand our feminist toolkit, expand our notion of what is a feminist issue. And we need to engage in purposeful reflection. How do we engage with others? The personal is the political, is the personal. Who are you forming intimate advocacy and community building relationships with? Who do you break bread with and talk politics and advocacy with? We all have a role to play in being anti-racist feminists. This is a first in a series of webinars and workshops addressing racism. There is so much that we did not touch on, including how race really intersects with various sites of vulnerability. This concentrated on anti-Black racism, but the struggle is beyond that. Let's continue our discussions in our chapters and on the national level, perhaps in your respective regional chapter meetings today. I will leave you with the words of Patrisse Cullors on the need for intersectional anti-racist leadership. Feel free to reach out to any one of us with questions and comments. The struggle continues, but it's been great to be with you today. Thank you. If we can just have the last clip play, that would be great.
We have to invest in Black leadership. That's what I've learned the most in the last few years. I think our work as movement leaders isn't just about our own visibility, but rather how do we make the whole visible? How do we not just fight for our individual selves, but fight for everybody? And I also think leadership looks like everybody in this audience showing up for Black lives. It's not just about coming and watching people on a stage, right? It's about how do you become that leader, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's in your home, and believe that the movement for Black lives isn't just for us, but it's for everybody.
Thank you, and I just want to say that our next segment is our Changemaker Awards, and so that's coming up before the breakouts. So please join us for the Changemaker Awards.